You're listening to Metal Matters, a weekly gimme radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill. If you like metal, punk, hardcore, or anything extreme, you've come to the right place. So subscribe and never miss out. I hope everyone's doing well and is staying healthy and safe. This week's episode is actually really cool. We have JJ Anselmi, author and drummer, musician, all-around cool guy. The fact that we're having this conversation, JJ and I, sort of closes a weird circle, which I get into later on in the episode. Anyway, JJ has a new book out called Doomed to Fail. It's about doom metal, post-rock, and that sort of vibe. It's kind of an interesting story how we came to this. A few months ago, I found out about your former band, and called Former Worlds.
Yeah.
And pre-ordered the record. Okay. Then you ran into Mark Vieira, the guy who manages my band Tombs.
Yeah.
And that's how you and I became acquainted.
Right.
So that's a pretty roundabout way of getting to this point where we're speaking across the continent on a telephone.
Yeah, for sure.
So.
I was pretty honored to have. I mean, like I'd mentioned, I'm a big Tombs fan, and so when you said you knew the Former Worlds record, I was like, oh shit. Well, I guess we did something right then. That's awesome.
Yeah, I pre-ordered it, and it turns out I also know the guy who put the record out, Stephen Williams.
Oh,
the guy
okay.
Who runs In It Records.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know, it's just like a funny, small sort of world scenario. But that brings us to your new book, Doomed to Fail. And that's, I picked the book up a few days ago, and I haven't had a chance to read the entire thing, but I scanned through it. And essentially, it's a history of a offshoot of extreme music that sort of developed out of what journalists likes to call sludge, doom metal, post metal, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, has it really developed into a separate genre of music?
I think the kind of doom from like the way Sabbath and like Candlemass set it out a long time ago still exists in different forms. But I think it's really just like heavy music as a whole is just really like widened its scope to where like it's much less about taking sounds from one particular like style and really trying to mesh everything together and kind of see what happens. That's one of the things I really liked about Tombs is there's that kind of black metal, but I never would have called you guys like a black metal band really. There's like elements of hardcore and like dark rock and even goth a little bit. So yeah, I think
definitely. I agree with that. So like for you as a musician starting out, you guys are from the Midwest, right? I never quite figured out where your origins were. I believe that you're from Wyoming originally.
Yeah, I grew up in Wyoming and have kind of moved around over the years. I lived in Denver, Colorado for about 6 years, and me and my buddy Grant formed the band In the Company of Serpents, which he's gone on to continue and do way more than I was only in the band. We only did a demo pretty much, but he's really turned it into its own whole thing. And then I've kind of moved around since then, and my wife and I lived in Minneapolis for a couple of years, and that's when I was in the band Former Worlds, and I currently live in Long Beach, which is hopefully the last move because moving across the country is fucking horrible. It's really not fun. So hopefully that's the last one.
Yeah, I've done that once, man, and it's brutal to move across the country like that.
Yeah,
for sure.
But I will say I'm super thankful for. It's just really shown me in each city kind of how special the metal community can be, and so I've just great lifelong friends in Denver, and then Minneapolis metal scene is really amazing. It's very tight knit. I miss so many people from there, and there's so much good music. And then I've been lucky enough to kind of find a similar community in Long Beach, and so yeah, I guess the good thing that came out of it is that I feel like I have these really amazing friends in different places. Although I wish I could see them more.
What was your entry point into playing music? Like what sort of stuff influenced you? Like why did you pick up drums? Like,
Yeah.
What was the sort of impulse to do all this stuff?
When I was like 12, my friend's older brother got really into Black Sabbath, and it must have been because we thought he was really cool. Me and my friends thought we should start a band, and I'm not exactly sure what it was about the drums. Maybe it just looked really fun. That's kind of how I always think about it, is like, what's the most logical instrument for a little kid to want to play? And you just see like somebody just going nuts and beating the shit out of these surfaces pretty much. And I'm like, that obviously looks the most fun to a little kid. So that was probably a big part of it. And so we started trying to cover Sabbath songs, and I guess from there I've just always I guess through junior high and high school I was never like super serious about it until I discovered like I Hate God. I remember that like super clearly in a BMX video, of that being like, dude, you should play music, and like this is the music for you. It just really kind of reached out to me, and I think it was this kind of like grimy and very from the earth. It kind of had like this blue collar vibe and this inviting quality of like, it's not super polished. It's not by like people who've spent 20 years getting PhDs in jazz guitar or something like that. It's just people who love the music, and it kind of showed me that it's for everybody. And then kind of later on, as the BMX thing, as I started getting like, I don't know, sick of getting hurt from BMX, I focused a lot more on music. And I think part of the doom and sludge thing is that I've never been a super good like technical player. I always wish I could play like crazy double bass like Pantera and Slayer stuff, but I used to try so hard, and it just never worked out to where it could be like solid in any form. And so when I found the sludge, it was like I was just like, here's some really aggressive music that you can be a caveman on your instrument and also pull it off.
Well, that's definitely a technique, working with space like that, because I actually find that I personally have problems with all that space.
Interesting.
And I mean, it's like the same way that you find it hard to play double bass and it's blast beats. Some people who are really good at playing blast beats can't really play slow with all that space. It creates anxiety for them at times.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. And you're totally right. I probably maybe sell myself short a little bit, but I think that's really true. And it seems rare when you find players, not only drummers but guitarists too, who are like really good at playing either fast and slow. And I feel like there's more and more nowadays as people kind of mesh genres, but for whatever reason it seems like a lot of us are we have like our go-to style that we're most comfortable in, and trying to do the other is a challenge for sure.
You referenced I Hate God earlier, and that's a band that sort of morphs that metal and punk aesthetic.
Yeah.
Like some people, you could look at I Hate God and appreciate that completely from a punk rock like standpoint, and you can also appreciate it from like just the heaviness of their music too.
Definitely.
And so being into BMX, I always associated BMX and skateboarding as kind of like this outsider, like sort of vibe.
Yeah.
And were you somebody who existed sort of on the outside of things when you were growing up, even before you got into music?
Yeah, for sure. And so, BMX and music really like went hand in hand with kind of like when I found myself in junior high was really like the first time I remember feeling kind of just I don't know, just separate in some kind of weird way. I guess the way I describe it is like viewing things from kind of the back of the room. It just seemed like I couldn't mesh with a lot of people super well. And so, yeah, that kind of like individuality that I found in BMX and heavy metal really worked super well. And so it's funny the way for me and my buddies to rebel was to be straight edge, because there was so much like addiction and drug use kind of surrounding us, and both like a family setting and also just socially. We lived in this kind of dead end blue collar town where there's just not much to do, and so kids would just get, the progression was like weed straight to meth for everybody.
Oh man.
Yeah, it was just and it was like, yeah, just super widespread. And so our way of kind of like separating ourselves is to be straight edge. And so, yeah, kind of like you mentioned, I think all those subcultures appeal to people who, yeah, for whatever reason, it just, I don't know, we need more time to ourselves, or like when I see a huge crowd, my knee jerk is to not go along with it, but to like react the exact opposite way. So whatever weird thing is in our DNA, I guess, I don't know.
Coming from that part of the country, were there other bands or other people, that you could play shows with, or did you guys have to travel a lot to do gigs?
So when I was in Wyoming, I was never like serious enough with music to travel, but that's kind of one of the cool things in small towns like that, is there are always dedicated kids that like will try to make the most out of it. And so there were people who would try and put on shows in like the local like Eagles Hall and kind of weird little public spaces like that. And so I feel like I took a lot of that into kind of my approach to music now, and that like I really do think it's what you make out of it. And I think you really got to put the work in, and kind of, to me, the bands I admire most have a pretty like staunch DIY approach to it and trying to make it happen for themselves. And I think Neurosis is like a really good example of that, of just kind of a band that has just found its own way in so many ways over the years, from the sound to the live show to starting their own label, and just who they are as people.
Yeah, Neurosis, along with you mentioned Black Sabbath and I Hate God. They're a band that I think are architects in this whole sound, really, and this whole way of doing things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think kind of going back to that like punk rock energy that you talked about, there's something like really special seemed to happen with Melvins and I Hate God and Neurosis, and that they took like the punk approach or punk mind frame, and then tried to see what they could do with that in heavy music. And I mean, the results really, speak for themselves. It really ended up defining a whole branch of not only extreme music, but just music in general. I think Neurosis just challenges, to me, what's even possible with sound. And they've like defined and then redefined that numerous times over the years, when to me, like, any musician is very lucky to have that happen once, but they've done it several times, which to me is pretty mind-blowing.
Do you have any favorite Neurosis records? I mean, they're one of my favorite bands too, so.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to ask you afterward, but yeah, it's a tough decision, but I do always go back to Through Silver and Blood, probably. Something about the vibe of that record. I remember it being like one of probably 3 records in my entire life that just playing it, like actually first listening to it in depth for the first time, was just like, it scared the shit out of me. I was just like, Jesus Christ, like it's just such a fucking journey into the darkest realms of the brain and just these weird areas that most people do not want to look at, especially in any kind of sustained way. And so, yeah, I'd say Through Silver and Blood, probably, for sure. And then, Jason Roeder's drumming on that has been a huge influence for sure. What about you?
I have to say Through Silver and Blood is probably my all-time favorite record. And I mean, that's a masterpiece. And
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is, if you read anything about the making of that record, you'll see that the members of the band were all going through some really intense personal stuff. And I think that vibe is what attracts people to it. The honesty, the intensity of the music is something that resonates with a lot of people. So it's not unusual.
Definitely. Yeah. And yeah, like you said, kind of the way they talk about it now about that period, like they use metaphors like bloodletting, or just like they'll say like it was absolute war. And it might sound like, you know, if you didn't know the record in the band, it might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not at all. It's spot on. You can tell there's like a very real, like, psychic sacrifice happening with that album.
When did you start writing? Was that something that was always part of your life from a young age, or when did you get into doing that?
Really, so I was always a straight edge kid through high school, and then I had kind of the stereotypical straight edge experience of, like, not being straight edge very suddenly, and then just being completely ridiculous with everything for a couple of years there. And so I never really got like really heavy into anything scary, but mostly just psychedelics, and started doing that stuff too much and became a little weird, I guess. I could tell I was kind of just drifting apart. I would start like thinking people were like plotting against me and just weird shit like that, to where I had kind of a realization that like I really needed to stop and kind of just be completely sober for a while. And so when I stopped doing drugs and drinking, it just opened up this huge, basically so much time, really. And not only that, but like just kind of creative space. And I've always been kind of a reader. As like growing up as a kid, my friends would always make fun of me because I would like go home and read like the Lord of the Rings books and shit like that. And so I think that kind of, attraction to literature has been there for a long time, probably stemming back to my mom and her just kind of, really finding solace in books. And so like when I really started to understand kind of myself as an adult person, writing just felt very natural, I guess, in a similar way as like heavy music did. It just seemed like something I should do. And the more and more I practiced it, I just really appreciated that kind of the space that it opened up in my head, and kind of the opportunity to like look back and try to figure myself out, or try to look at a piece of art in depth. And so writing about music then became another like kind of natural outlet for that to take too. And I started to really appreciate when I first started doing like my first album reviews, the way that like I feel like I hear a record on a different level when I know I'm going to write about it. And I can really like focus on it and look at the details, and it really makes me appreciate stuff on a different level.
Your first book though was like loosely music based, but it was more of a narrative though. So was that, writing in that narrative style, is that something that you had like inside of you that you wanted to express, maybe as a result of all of the sort of journalism that you were doing?
The narrative style was actually came before like the journalism. I think I've always been attracted to like fiction, and when I was in my early 20s, I really got into writers like Charles Bukowski and Hunter S. Thompson and Jack Kerouac, who are kind of, again, like you said, there's that kind of like outsider quality of just kind of weirdos who they were never really accepted in like an academic literary setting, and maybe looked down upon by certain crowds, but it really grabbed me. And so I think the narrative stuff came first, and then the journalism is afterward. But I think really I'm probably more of a narrative writer at the end of the day. The next books that I write will be a lot more narrative based for sure.
Yeah, it's funny, Bukowski, that I think that a lot of men in their early 20s discover those writers. Like anyone who's going, you know what I mean? It's like a common story, it seems like. It's really funny.
For sure.
Because I was the same, man. Like, have you ever read John Fonte?
Yeah, huge fan of Fonte too.
Yeah, that's kind of, you can see the similarity in writing styles between Bukowski and Fonte, as well as, the obvious ones, Hemingway, like especially the early, like the Nick Adams stories, I find to be very similar to Charles Bukowski.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, like you said, there's that kind of period in a lot of dudes' lives where it's like, I guess you're kind of like starting to really think for yourself, and like I said, kind of, like become more of an adult and like an actual thinking person. And I think those writers were like a really good just thing to engage with at that point in time, along with like really delving into weirder aspects of heavy music. When I was first getting into like Bukowski and Kerouac was when I was like really first discovering like Neurosis and Sun and Harvey Milk, and the kind of, I guess you could say more intellectual heavy music, but I kind of, I don't know, balk at that term because it sounds pretentious, because that music to me is not pretentious at all. It's super smart, but it's not pretentious, I don't think.
Yeah, that music is definitely speaking to like something higher than maybe just the kind of visceral nature of some stuff. I mean, you listen to Neurosis, it's different. I'm not saying it's better, but it's different than listening to like Cannibal Corpse or something like that. For
sure.
I mean, two great bands, but just different. They're exercising different muscles,
Yeah, it takes you to a super different mental space, and kind of going back to like what you're saying, like the kind of space that it can be hard to fill as a musician, I think is kind of hard for some listeners to maybe engage with, or I myself don't want to engage with it all the time, because it's, I can't listen to Neurosis, like only Neurosis. That would be a very, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't be that bad, but I think I would get very tired because it's super taxing.
Yeah, definitely. It's especially seeing them live, it's like you pretty much you're all set for a while for that, what I mean?
Yeah, and especially with like the weirder like Sun or something like that, I can't. It's not like a casual listen. When I want to listen to it, I'm like kind of gotta mentally prepare myself.
So with your first book, Heavy, was that sort of did that come as a result of your fascination with like Charles Bukowski and all that? It has an autobiographical characteristic to it. Yeah.
At that point, I kind of, when I was in my early 20s and knowing that I wanted to write, and just like you do as a musician, you kind of look for people who've done something similar, who come from a similar state of mind. And it seemed like Bukowski and Kerouac and Hunter S. Thompson, there's like fictionalized aspects, but it's really all autobiographical at the end of the day. Like they're essentially writing from their own perspective, and the main character is always themselves in a certain sense. And so, I think that really shaped me kind of wanting to write autobiographically. And in another sense, I always had like a lot of trouble trying to step out completely outside and invent a character just, like whole cloth. And it seemed like whenever I would try to write fiction, I was just writing some version of events that I had experienced anyway. So at some point I was like, dude, you should just write, like, why not just write nonfiction? And it kind of fell into place from there. Yeah.
So now we're up to Doomed to Fail, your new book. And so what was the impetus for writing this one? This is, kind of a history of what we'd mentioned before, doom, post-metal, sludge, like all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so after heavy and kind of the really heavy like introspection and looking back at my hometown, especially, I think writing that book would really place me in that place. And it's not necessarily like a place I want to be all the time. And so I think with Doomed to Fail, I knew that I wanted to write a book about heavy music because it's had such a huge impact on my life. And then it kind of took a little bit to get there, to like figure out exactly what the book would be. At first, really the very beginnings of it was, I don't know if you know the books 33 and a Third. They're like those little...
Yeah. There was one on Masters of Reality, I think, and Rain and Blood. There's like, it's not just metal, exactly. It covers a lot of genres of music,
Yeah, and so I really loved the John Darnielle one, who, I mean, it's kind of a tangent. He's since become like one of my favorite writers. Not only that book, but his novels are just phenomenal. But so yeah, those 33 and a Third books, and so there was a open call for submissions from that publisher, and I thought it'd be sick to do one on I Hate God. And the album that has always really stood out to me from them is Dope Sick. And so when I reached out to the band about like maybe potentially working on that, they essentially told me that like Dope Sick wasn't the record that they would want to focus on too much. And kind of what I got is that it's like they were severely like, that was just a very fucked up time for them as a band. And I don't think they're super proud of that record, but I think it's I Hate God to a T. It's incredibly dirty. It's fucking fierce. It's scary. So yeah, they basically told me that they wouldn't want to like talk about that record in depth, and the proposal ended up getting rejected anyway. And so from there, I just kind of wondered like, how could I expand this and really examine it. I thought maybe a full band biography would be the way to do it, but then I realized I was more interested in trying to trace doom and sludge and this heavy music as art forms, because I bet you've had like a similar experience in that, like there's always like some kind of like explanation I feel like I have to include with like, yeah, I listen to metal, but like it can be really smart too. Or there's always been some period where you have to kind of like justify, being into like really aggressive music for people who don't like quite understand it. And so I think Doomed to Fail maybe stemmed from that. And like, I've always thought heavy music is a legit art form, like, as high as and profound as anything else, from, like the craziest, most interesting paintings to like full-on symphonies and jazz music and stuff. And so I think at the end of the day, Doomed to Fail was me trying to just lay out this branch of heavy music that has meant the world to me as this art form, and trying to kind of give it the critical context that I feel like it deserves.
No, that's pretty cool, because I've often felt the same thing all the way back to punk rock music too, even from like the 70s onward. I remember probably in my early 20s when I was reading a lot of Charles Bukowski and writing in my notebook, thinking about how people are going to look back at punk rock as like, the later 20th century blues or something,
For sure. That finally has happened. It took people like, writing about it, and really like the people who understood the music really had to be the ones who wrote about it and kind of put it in context. From like, there's the book, Please Kill Me, I thought is like fucking amazing account of punk. And then, more like, in-depth accounts and kind of analysis of like what punk can be and how widespread, or how far you can kind of push that ideology.
So how did you go about selecting the bands to write about? It's just, what was the process that you went through to figure that out?
Yeah, that was a tough one. I mean, some of them were like no-brainers, like Sabbath, obviously, heavy metal and doom wouldn't exist. You can pretty much, there's a pretty clear like a moment for when the song Black Sabbath came out. It's like you put anything from that time up next to it and it just sounds totally different. It's a completely different world. And so there's a few of those bands where it's just like kind of no-brainers, like, I Hate God and Neurosis and Melvins, where they're just so far ahead of their time and doing something super, super unique that became incredibly influential. So those bands were pretty easy, but then when it became like, I think some of the doom bands that I've loved over the years, that like when I really looked at it kind of next to other stuff from the time, I made the tough decision of like, I don't think it was as influential as this other record. And so that was kind of the decision-making process, is really trying to, as best as I could, having been, I'm 34 years old, having not been like really in the music scene during some of those moments, as much as I could as a listener, and just really thinking hard about it, looking at the records that I felt pushed whatever given style it was further in terms of like influence, or just doing something a little bit more unique with it. And so that was a decision process in a lot of it. And then another facet was kind of trying to really, I don't know, highlight women musicians and people of color too, because I don't know, metal, people think it can be, and it is like overwhelmingly like white dudes and stuff, but I don't think it has to be that way. And so I tried to kind of highlight people who are outside those categories to, try to show that heavy music truly is for everybody.
Definitely. And that's something that on the, being from the East Coast and, New York, New Jersey area specifically, there are quite a bit of people of color and different cultures involved in making, punk and hardcore, metal and all that stuff out here. So that's definitely pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the same thing with, that's been one of the things I really love about Long Beach, where I live, and LA, is I feel like the metal scene here is, diverse in this really cool way that, it's fucking great. I love it.
So how do you react to a lot of this, kind of right wing influences in some of the extreme music? Or do you think a lot of the clickbaity articles that have been written about some of these, not the bands specifically in this book, but in general, there's a lot of internet chatter about right-wing politics and all this stuff showing up in heavy metal?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it really depends on the band a lot of times. I mean, there's, examples of the straight up just like racism and stuff in black metal. And it's, like straightforward answer is that it's really gross and it's not something I want to interact with in any other way. But then there is that kind of the other flip side to it of like Burzum is always a good example, because like his politics are pretty disgusting, but you also at the same time can't really deny like the influence. And so it does get tricky with metal, because it does attract those pretty extreme personalities a lot of times. And so that can be extreme in like a very ugly way that, is not necessarily something that should be reinforced in the world. I Hate God is definitely, I Hate God is another one where like, over the years, as I've thought more and more about kind of like race in America and what it means to like have the Confederate flag on your guitar and like a song called, White N-word and stuff. Some of that stuff becomes harder and harder to stomach, I think, once you look at the larger context. But then again, like I said, there's that kind of thing that you can't deny that, I wouldn't be playing music if it wasn't for I Hate God. So there's some complexity there that I think, maybe to go back to your question, can get, I don't know, like it tends to disappear in like the internet chatter type discussions. Because I think if you look really honestly And for me, at least, like kind of who I am and where I come from, there's some, ugly aspects for sure.
Yeah, I think the internet definitely sort of sidesteps any complexity when it comes to discussing anything that has any sensitivity to it. It's either like this very dogmatic standpoint, of like either you agree or disagree. There's no gray areas. There's no complexity at any of the points. So, but I think life in general is way more nuanced and complex than people like to think it is.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, again, the I Hate God is like the perfect example for me with this stuff because, they're still one of my favorite bands and probably will always be one of my favorite bands. While at the same time, I'm like, some of that shit you guys did, I'm like, I don't think you guys should, I don't agree with it. I think you guys were totally wrong. Like, they would say, like, with the Confederate flag and song titles and stuff that it was a joke, but I don't know. The more I thought about it, I was like, I don't think that can be really a joke. Like to some people it can be, like if you're, white and stuff, but to other people, like that shit is not a fucking joke. And so yeah, and like I said, I mean, I wouldn't be here if, talking to you quite literally if it wasn't for I Hate God. And so it reminds me of like if you ever had like a racist like family member or something like that, where like they've been there for you your entire life and they've really helped you, but then there's this very ugly aspect to them. And I guess that's how I think about I Hate God and some of those bands.
Yeah, I was going to use that same example actually, because I
Yeah.
have a lot of, my family is pretty deeply entrenched in like New York City and Long Island and whatnot. Very kind of like old school, like typical like New York City types that,
Yeah.
they definitely have some colorful ideas about things. And on the flip side of that, I wouldn't be the person I am today without those people in my life. And,
Yep.
it's a complicated situation, and that's kind of, I think you have to look at everything case by case a lot of times.
Yep. Yeah. And so, yeah, very long answer to your question. Yeah. It's the more I come back to it, it really is case by case. I can't make like a broad statement. I mean, I have my politics and stuff I believe, but as far as like when it comes across in somebody else's music, I really have to approach it just on an individual basis.
So what's next for you as far as, you got anything on the horizon, either musically or with your writing?
Yeah. So, my, band here in, Long Beach called, Drainage. We just, played a show last night celebrating, release of a new 7-inch that we have. There's some like sludge elements for sure, but there's also like we're big fans of like Coalesce and kind of that like late 90s early 2000s weird metalcore, I guess you would call it, but yeah, still trying to be pretty abrasive. So that just came out. And then as far as writing, the concept I have is to do a oral history of my hometown. But I mean that I haven't even started. And so completion on that would be like, at the very least, probably 5 years away from like a book being in the world.
Do you, which do you enjoy more, writing or creating music? Is that a weird question?
No, it's not weird. I think they really, to me, complement each other super well, because the music for me is like, it's very physical. I'm not like a classically trained musician in any way. So yeah, it's a super kind of like physical lizard-brained exercise in a lot of ways. I mean, it's still like, I try to incorporate like weird changes and timings and stuff, but I think ultimately I'm a lizard brain type musician. And then writing is, way more just like the other complete side of your brain of just like very analytical and looking at things kind of in depth and ruminating and maybe being a little bit slower to react, and it's less immediate. And so I think those two things work together super well. When I might hit like a brick wall with writing, there's not really anything better I could do with music. And then when I need a break from being in a band and playing shows, writing is that like perfect kind of solitude.
That's awesome. I got to say about your drumming, though, you say that it's caveman, but the only drumming I really know of yours is from the former World stuff. And it's funny, right before I called in, I was listening to the record and I was like, man, this is like, it's kind of hard to follow, There's like it's funny because as a listener, I'm like, oh, there's like some intricate arrangements going on here, but it might not be that at all. It might just be like one big jam that you guys are doing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think for my status in the band, it's kind of like the lizard brain, like physical, but then, there's a lot of those like weird changes and timings. A lot of it came from the guitarist. I always get confused what to call him in that band because he plays a Fender Bass 6, but he like essentially plays it like a guitar. And anyway, whatever he does, he's a really smart musician and he knows a lot more than I do about like timings and weird syncopation and stuff. And so it was really cool to be in a band with him because he pushed me so hard to progress in that realm. And I think he's a huge reason of why that stuff is there. As far as like maybe the music I would produce of my own volition, it would be a lot more like I Hate God probably.
Yeah, but even that stuff too has like this kind of off kilter. It's
true.
The one is like in a weird place, and you know what I mean. It has like this kind of odd time feel to it as well,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's that, and there's stuff. There's really that kind of weird jazz New Orleans. Yeah, the one is always in some weird spot. Like a lot of times it's still 4/4, but like if you and it might sound simple at like first listen, but like if you try to actually play it, it's like, whoa, what the fuck are these guys doing? It's super weird.
Oh yeah,
so, yeah, maybe
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I tried to play along to some of their stuff like over the years, and it's like the chords and the notes, but they come in weird places, and it's actually really hard
super
to play.
Weird. Yeah, and so maybe there probably is a lot of bleed between trying to wed the lizard brain and something a little bit more analytical and stuff with music too. But yeah, thanks. That's a huge compliment coming from you. Like I said, I'm a huge Tombs fan. I saw you guys in Denver. I'm trying to remember the tour at the Marquee Theater.
Oh yeah, that's we played Denver a ton over the years. But thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. Anyone that I run into that appreciates the band, I definitely think that's cool.
Yeah, and Mark showed me some of the new Tombs stuff. Oh no, the new Tombs is out, right?
It's out right now. Yeah, it just came out a couple weeks ago.
Oh shit, yeah, I forgot because he sent it to me like a week before it came out, and I listened to it and was very stoked on the new direction, and I got to go back to it. But cool. Winter Hours I spent a lot of time with that record for sure.
Yeah, there's I'm working on some other material for this thing I'm doing that's maybe a little bit more along those lines. That's I'm still formulating it right now, but it's going to be a separate band that's going to be kind of in that vein, but not just like recreating that, but maybe taking elements of that and like crossing it with something else,
Fuck yeah, I'm excited to hear it.
Cool. Well, thanks for taking the time and doing this. I appreciate it. Sounds like you have a really busy press thing going on today. So
it's all good. Yeah.
Is there any
so much,
website
Mike.
Addresses or anything like that you want to get out there? Any social media, things people can follow you at?
Follow me on Twitter, and then you can find a bunch of my writing and music just at jjanselmi.com. So Former Worlds and Drainage and some of the other shit I've done over the years, in addition to like book excerpts and different writing.
And you can buy a hard copy of both of your books on Amazon too. So.
Yep. Yeah. Amazon, and yeah, if you want to do Barnes & Noble or IndieBound is another resource I've been steering people toward, because you can order it through there, and then you can also like find the nearest independent bookshop where they're selling the books.
Cool. That's great.
Yeah.
You got to make sure we give like support to the local brick and mortar places too.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's the same as like the good record store that you find in your younger years, that like there's that clerk that shows you like, just this music that's fucking amazing that you wouldn't have found otherwise. I think that is super valuable, and really you only find it, at the bookstore, at the record store.
Well, once again, man, thanks a lot, and everyone out there, be sure to check out the new book, Doomed to Fail.
Thanks so much, Mike.
That's it for this week's episode of Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio weekly podcast. Tune in next week and see what we have in store for you. The show is available on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, etc. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio, streaming on the web, iOS, or Android, for one of the best metal communities, exclusive merch, interviews with artists, and so much more. I'll catch you guys next week. Take care.